galactic travelers. Thanks for tuning in and welcome. I'm your host, Galen Farrel, and in this episode 3, I'm going to talk about culture. What is culture? How does it evolve? And in so doing, how does it create our narrative? So, what is culture? Culture could be described as the accumulation of acceptable and beneficial behaviors learned and passed down from parent to child, from grandparent to child, from one generation to the next. It's a very human adaptation. Culture is to humans like hives are to bees. Culture is our vessel, and it comes in various forms. Now, the culture of which we are a part is a relatively new culture in the course of human history. We often think of human history as dating back to maybe 4,000 years BCE, and things before that, before Egypt, or maybe even just before Christianity, are considered prehistory. Now, maybe with contemporary anthropology, we might consider history dating back to 10,000 BC. But often when we think of history, we think of it in terms of humanity and human civilization. However, if we look at history in terms of the biological community, our scope might extend much farther back to, say, maybe 60 million years ago with the dinosaurs, or farther than that. Or if we looked at history in terms of geological time, it would go much farther still. If we looked at history in terms of cosmological time, it would be so expansive that it's almost incomprehensible, because it's infinite. So now, with that in mind, when we talk about human culture and its evolution meaning change over the course of time, we can start to consider that our cultural history, our various cultures, have evolved over a much longer period than just that which we typically think of as the history of humanity. So, in the previous video, talking about narrative, I briefly touched on what is our culture. Our culture being our cumulative set of beliefs and behaviors that dictate what is acceptable in our lives. It's our story of how we came to be, where we are today, and how we shall continue. Concerning everything from what foods we eat and how we obtain those foods, to our methods of trade, commerce, barter, and the fact that trade, commerce, etc. are a method at all. Our relationships with one another, this is all dictated by our cultural narrative. So, to bring contrast to what is culture, could illustrate as the primary existing example of a culture different than our own mother culture, which most of humanity and human civilization is a part, could give an example of this primary other culture, which would be the various remaining hunter-gatherer groups of the world, such as the Alawa Aborigines of Australia, the various Inuit groups of Alaska, the native Brazilian Amazonian tribes, the Kalahari Bushmen. The list continues. And for the most part, these ancient cultures are hanging on by the fringes. But they are an example. So, what we can consider in that contrast is we can see two different examples of culture setting the stage, creating the narrative of how individuals and groups of people, civilizations, or tribes live their lives by a set of guidelines, a cultural narrative. And considering culture in terms of history and in terms of evolution, it's discernible to see that culture manifests over time by trial and error of best practices or what works and what didn't, to culminate into the manifestation we see today. And we continue living this mythos. Cultural narrative, and understanding of what culture is important to consider and have an understanding of as a foundation to go on to discuss what I'm going to continue to talk about in the times to come on Resonant Being. And it's why cultural narrative is a major concept in the channel description. It's because of cultural narrative that we are living the way that we are. And with cultural narrative, we will be guided into the future. So this will bring me to the final video of this channel introduction series, in which I'm going to talk about the last part of the channel description, which is advocacy of a good way to live. Why advocate a good way to live? How can we describe a set of parameters in which what is a good way to live? And how can we use our understanding of cultural narrative, of resonance, of resonating our cultural narrative to actively participate in creating a better world. So, once again, thanks for tuning in. This is Resonant Being, and I'll see you next.